Is Seele still good? And I don't mean necessarily is she a fine character. I mean, from a legitimate standpoint, let's say hypothetically, you're going into the next couple patches and you're wondering that since you've been hearing about a Seele rerun, is she worth picking up? I think the answer to that is a little bit more difficult now. And I know characters like Mbaba Lunai, theoretically, kind of knocks her off in terms of highest DPS. But it's not just that, it's in terms of what potential does she have, her Eidolons and constellations, or her light cone in terms of what buff she gives herself, and how valuable is that buff. If we're looking at Mbaba Lunai, by rough comparison, his E2 gives it action forward. Great, nice, perfectly cool. If we're looking at his traces though, and this is what I want to focus on, his traces give him damage or crowd control resist, which is essentially like effect resistance for most people. And then you also get 24 crit damage. At the same time, if you're looking at the bonuses he can give himself, the crit damage is increased as well. Seele doesn't have this. If we're looking at Blade, Blade has a relic set that essentially buffs his own crit rate, which is really nice, and then his light cone buffs it even further, and a damage percent bonus. That's great. And what I want to say here is with both of these, Blades and Mbaba Lunais and so on, these don't require you to hit any prerequisites. With Blades, it's just get hit or consume your own HP. He does that naturally every time he attacks. With Dan Heng, it's essentially, hey, here's a nice bit of energy regen and attack percent for using your basic attack. That's all he does. With Seele, the problem is, first off, if you're not, you might just be getting this 18% crit rate. That's perfectly cool. But her light cone relies on you having essentially 160 speed to max out the bonus attack, the basic attack, and skill damage, and the crit damage of the ultimate. Mind you, that crit damage doesn't extend to all of her abilities. If it was you get crit rate and then you get a maximum of X amount of crit damage overall once you have 160 speed, that'd be better. But it's limited to her ult, and her damage is spread pretty evenly between her ult and her skill. And I think that one of the biggest issues or things that might be holding her back in comparison to other characters is if you're looking at her Eidolons, they don't really do much. Her E1 is 15% crit rate, but the enemy has to have lower than 80% HP. Now, don't get me wrong, in big boss battles it's perfectly fine, but when you're accounting for this, it means you can't necessarily reach her max potential in terms of crit because you do always have to consider you're getting a 15% bonus. You don't want to overcap, which may not be a problem for a lot of you, and normally it isn't, but still, I think most people would either rather have an outright damage buff, something like Blades, or some form of buffing potential for her kit overall. Her E2 is just a solid buff. It's 25 roughly speed to add on, but it's not exactly damaging increase. That speed is nice for getting more actions, that speed is nice for buffing out her light cone, but that speed doesn't necessarily equal a direct DPS increase like immediate action forward would, with the equivalent to not consuming any skill points, or like just raw damage bonus would be. Which this is a crit rate, this is the equivalent to Seele's E1. However, this is no prerequisite. The enemy doesn't have to be below 50% HP. This is just a solid 15% crit rate. And so by comparison, Seele's Eidolons are worse. Now, I don't want it to seem like she's bad. Her E4 is great. The energy regen, wonderful. Because she relies on defeating an enemy. But once again, the prerequisite is, it relies on her defeating an enemy. Fu Xuan's E4 just gives her enemy when people are hit. Once again, I feel like Seele's Eidolons are early and they're nice and they all help her out, but they only help her out under specific circumstances. You need to be below 80% HP for the opponent. You need to have her light cone for this to be worthwhile. You can run attack percent boost, but why would you in other circumstances? And you need to defeat an enemy for this. Most of the time, you're going to be using your ultimate on the boss, and your team will be handling the smaller mobs, because for the most part, you want your highest damaging character to be on the big mobs, and your smaller or weaker enemy characters to be focusing on the little mobs that attack you. So that 15 energy isn't going to go a lot unless you're picking off the smaller mobs to attack the big ones, and even then, in certain circumstances, this doesn't work. The enemies that self-revive, though they don't count. They don't count as defeated enemies, so you don't get your resurgence and you won't get your energy. And then her E6. Her E6 is a nice bonus increase. It gives her a slight amount of damage over time, which is cool, and it gives her a slight buff to her ultimate, but you have to go through E1 to E5 to get here. And I think given the current roster of characters, as a hunt unit, she's single target. Great. But in comparison to Destruction and Erudition, and if we're just looking at Destruction right now, the damage she's dealing doesn't feel like it makes it worthwhile to go for. Don't get me wrong, Dan Heng is a wonderful character. He has good Eidolons. If we're talking about points of comparison, and I just want to go through the relative DPSs we have Blade, who is a character with pretty good eidolons all the way through. Seele's E1, except without the prerequisites, a nice damage buff here, and then, 20% HP increase. That's just damage. These are all just damage. And this is just, allowing him to do his follow-up attack more, which is, once again, just damage along with the HP increase. So, if I'm looking at Seele, and her eidolons, and her kit is essentially geared towards boosting her own damage, then I expect damage increasing eidolons. But that's not what we get. We get a character who has naturally high base speed, which is perfectly fine. If we're looking at Seele right now, if we're looking at Seele right now, she has naturally high base speed. And an additional 50% of that once you have E2 is good because it's more actions. But that only applies if you're utilizing this light cone. If you're utilizing any other hunt light cone, you don't need that damage increase. You don't need that speed increase. You don't get a bonus from that. You only are essentially getting that crit rate increase in most circumstances. And her eidolons, despite being good, don't benefit her as much as other characters would if they had other damaging eidolons. So from a value perspective, she as a character is nice, but let's be honest here. She as a character fits only comfortably in a mono quantum-esque team, and in bigger boss battles, you would rather have a higher damage character who can output a big nuke early on than one who takes 2 turns to essentially get up. Because if she only gets her speed buff, mind you, this E2 requires her to get her speed buff after using her skill, you essentially need to use your skill twice. You need to take 2 actions. And if before those 2 actions, you don't have the maximum buff from her light cone. So in those circumstances, this character does fall off a bit, especially if you're accounting or trying to account for a 15% crit rate increase. And I think that she's a fine character, she's nice, and as much as people like to say, oh yeah, she doesn't have any issues, she's a fun character, she's a nice character, and as much as people like to say she doesn't have any issues, Resurgence having 2 proc for a vast majority of her buffs to apply is a big one. She can be fun, and I think she fits relatively nicely in pretty decent teams. Mono Quantum is great at the moment. Even though we don't have a quantum buffer, you can still slide this over. But if you're comparing her to the options you have upcoming, Topaz, if you compare her to Fushuan right now, Jingliu, to replace your Yanqings, it's a more difficult comparison to make. Because as a unit, she doesn't have the same ability to buff her own damage, to resist debuffs, to buff her crits, or anything like that. She can buff her speed, and speed is great and necessary and all that, but how many of you have such a hard time speed tuning characters like Yukong or Bronya to run right after your DPS? It's a very difficult thing to do, and when a character buffs themselves to have over 180 speed, it is just unbearable to try. And I know that's a niche case scenario, but I don't want to in any way, shape, or form downplay that this character is good. She's just not going to have the maximum potential that characters like Blade or Embabber Lunai or Jingliu likely and other units are going to have. Even Jing Yuan is going to technically get a buff with Topaz. Is that going to be a buff to make him better? No, but he has AoE. And once again, she has no AoE. Being able to target one character or one enemy and then move on to the next once they're dead is not AoE. That is just single target damage, because all that damage is only applying to one enemy. AoE, and this is the thing I want to go over, AoE is essentially when your target or your damage is spread throughout multiple opponents at once. If you are only dealing damage to one enemy, and then you can only move on when that enemy is dead, all you've done is deal single target damage. Seele's not an AoE character. And as a result of that, she has to have higher multipliers. Yanqing buffs himself with crit. That makes him easier to build. That's a bonus to him. Seele buffs herself with speed, but Yanqing also buffs himself with a minor amount of speed as well. And to that effect, Seele lacks a lot of the additional bonuses that these other units have. And looking at Blade here, he heals himself. Cool. He heals himself again after weakness broken enemies. Great. And he deals additional damage. If we're looking at Seele by comparison, yeah, action forward is nice, but no one wants to use a basic attack with the character who's meant to be using skills. Okay, quantum res penetration. Great. This is exceptional. This is nah. Because the vast majority of you would choose to run your Seele with another healer or some form of preservation. And so once again, I'm not saying she's bad. I just think that the value she once had has diminished a bit, and as of right now, we're in a position to where there are so many other viable characters who may not be quantum that it does make her seem worse by comparison. I want to hear your thoughts down below though. Will you be pulling for her if she gets a Rerun? Will you be going for Eidolons? I think she's a fine character. I wish she had a better outfit, but I think she's fine. But I also run my Silver Wolf as a DPS more often, so I don't know. Either way, I'll see you guys next time.